Good morning, ladies. It's great to be with you today. Even though it's virtual, I still feel like we're in a class together and we're learning together. Although I have to admit, this is a class I'd rather not teach. In fact, a friend of my daughter, Susan, said to her when she heard what I was teaching today, "What, did your mom lose a bet?" It's inconceivable that anyone would want to teach about holy war, the warfare that was fought and the rules by which it's fought in the conquering of the promised land. Now, I will tell you, today we've seen examples of holy war, even in recent history. The Bosnian conflict, the jihads, the crusades were all called holy wars, wars with God on our side. But were they really? Can a war be holy or fought with the same rules as it was fought by the Israelites when they conquered the promised land? Can those rules be followed today? Should they? Or were they for a specific occasion, a specific time? Is our version of God a bloodthirsty, racist, geneticist? Or were the circumstances different in the Old Testament? And therefore, can we understand them a little bit better? But I'm going to be looking with you at Deuteronomy chapter 20, which is, I think, one of the best places to find the principles of holy war. They're outlined in chapter 20 in 4 sections. You'll see the first section, verses 1 to 4, is a sermon given by the priests on courage. This sermon was given to remind those in the army that they were going forward, indeed fighting a battle, as it said in verse 4, the Lord your God is the one who goes with you, to fight for you against your enemies, to give you victory. This was intended to give them courage and to place the battle that they were about to engage in perspective. The second section is this long section on exemptions for military duty, verses 5 through 9. Now, as you read this, you wonder if there's going to be anybody left to fight the battle. But as Israel's victory depends on God's presence and not military strength, exemptions are allowed in a number of cases where the best interest of the land and the people might be desired. Things like, if you're newlywed, don't go to war. If you're faint-hearted or afraid, don't go to war. Don't be afraid. Don't go to war. Only those who feel total trust in the Lord fighting the battle for them should go. And then we have rules for war, verse 10 to 18. And this is the difficult part for our modern minds. First of all, for warfare against nations outside of the promised land, nations that wage war against the Israelites that are not within the boundaries of the promised land, cities that reject Israel's offer of peace, an offer which would result in their men being killed and their women and children becoming slaves. You could see how that might not be desirable. That offer of peace, if they reject that, the men are killed. The women and children are enslaved. The animals and material goods become plunder. Verse 16 to 18 then states the policy for cities that are within the promised land. Those who reject Israel's offer for peace shall be totally destroyed. We then get to the fourth part, limitations, in verse 19 to 20. The uprooting of trees was a common practice in the ancient world, designed to totally cripple the land that was left behind. But in the case of the promised land, the Lord intended those trees to become the possession of the Hebrews. And therefore, he said, do not uproot the trees. Only those that you need, that do not bear fruit, that you need to use for siege weapons, should be cut down. Very practical. So what can we learn from Deuteronomy 20, and indeed other biblical sections concerning holy war? First of all, holy war is not presented in the Bible as a template for believers everywhere in all times. These battles actually represent specific actions in the history of Israel. These wars were fought at a particular time and are not to be repeated by the church, nor to be justified for any peoples in the present world. This kind of warfare was particular to Israel as they moved into the land of Canaan. Secondly, a holy war is an act of a patient and merciful God. It's not a story of genocide or ethnic cleansing. God commanded divine war against Canaan, but only after 400 years of waiting for their sins to reach full measure. We read that in Genesis 15:16. That is to say, God did not punish the Canaanites for sin immediately. His mercy extended long because his compassion and his grace are long. If the Canaanites had turned to God, would God have saved them and forgiven them? Well, look, Rahab, who we'll see later on in the book of Joshua, she was not only a Canaanite, but she was a prostitute, and yet she was saved because of her turning to God and her faith in God. The story of Rahab is not unique. We have Jethro, the Midianite, who is brought into the fold of Israel because of his faith. We have the ancestors of Jesus himself, Ruth, a Moabitess, who's clearly brought into the fold because of her faith. Joseph and Moses' children are of mixed ethnicity as well, and yet they are brought into the family of God. Third, the holy war is about eliminating false worship. Ultimately, it's not about people, but worship. Holy war represents a focused attack on sinful and idolatrous religion rather than simply an attack on people. In Deuteronomy 7:3-5, 12:2-3, and Exodus 24:12-13, you can look those up later. Dr. Heath Thomas, a writer who I follow, explained this well when he said, to get at the religious ideals of an ancient people, you have to address more than, say, their spiritual lives. This is because they did not separate secular from spiritual the way that we do. This is hard for us to hear and understand. But ancient people saw their national identity tied to their particular place and their religion tied to this particular God who occupied only that space. In other words, for the Moabites, their land was ruled by a God who operated in this region southeast of the Jordan River. Their patron god Chemosh was a god of that land as well as a god of those people. For the Canaanites, it was Baal who governed them in the land of Canaan. For the Hebrews, their particular place was the land of Israel, and God ruled them from Jerusalem. However, unlike all the nations around him, God was more powerful even and was not limited by the land which God had used for his promised people. God could overcome foreign gods. And if the Moabites, for example, were defeated or displaced, that showed that their deity was false. If the Canaanites were defeated or displaced, that showed that Baal was false. Israel's God, Yahweh, was the only God in the ancient Near East who's able to leave his land and return to both in his own power. We see this later in Ezekiel. The point's straightforward. For Israel's God to show the gods of the nations to be false, a simple sermon wouldn't do. He chose to demonstrate his power so that the world would know the strength of God, of Yahweh. And remember, those who heard of this God and responded in faith would be spared and receive the blessing that comes with worshiping the true God. The clearest example, again, of this comes in the form of Rahab, who told the Israelites that all in Canaan had heard of God's fame and mighty power, and then made a pact with the Israelites. We'll see this again in Joshua. Finally, let me present what I think is the most concise understanding of the differences between our current warfare and holy war as taught by Dr. Doug Stewart from Gordon Conwell, my alma mater, one of my favorite professors. Holy war may be summarized by 12 propositions that Dr. Stewart presented. First of all, there was no standing army. There's no draft. There's no required service. All the battles are fought by amateurs. They're all volunteers who are utterly dependent on God for their success. They could not boast that their training or superior weapons, their horses, as we read sometimes in Scripture, or their chariots, were the things that caused them victory. Potential soldiers were allowed, even encouraged, to give excuses for not serving. Like I said, even cowardice was okay, because God wanted those who were willing to serve him to fight for him. Number 2, the soldiers worked without compensation. The soldiers were fighting solely for the purpose of advancing justice and God's will, not for remuneration. There were no mercenaries, no paid soldiers. And in light of this, number 3, no personal spoil or plunder was allowed. In the ancient world, warriors often fought for the particular privilege of taking whatever they wanted from the conquered land and conquered peoples. That was their pay. The Israelites were actually told, do not take these things. Do not have people say you're fighting for the sake of property. Holy war, number 4, could only be waged for the conquering or the protection of the promised land. Israel had no right to any other land or to wage war for any other purpose. And number 5, only at Yahweh's call, only at the Lord's call, could holy war be waged. There was no national voting, no consensus, no decision made by Parliament or Senate, or not even the king or the leading priest. Only a prophet could declare a holy war in the name of the Lord. The prophet was the only one, number 6, who could speak for God. Moses, of course, was the prophet. Number 7, the Lord did the real fighting in the holy war. The war was, and is ultimately his. The true war is a cosmic one between Satan and his legions. Israel was simply God's delegated tool to fight the earthly battle against these forces. We see this later in Ephesians chapter 6, where we read, our battle is not against flesh and blood. Number 8, holy war was a religious undertaking, and it was to be prepared for by fasting, abstaining from sexual activity, and other forms of self-denial. It was an act of obedience to God, not of national pride, not of military strategy. 9, the goal of holy war was the annihilation of an evil culture. The Canaanite culture, for example, had become so progressively evil that God could do nothing other than to exterminate it. In such cases, the entire culture was to be annihilated. No plunder was to be taken. The annihilation of culture would ensure that the Israelites would not be seduced in the future by foreign gods. 10, those who violated the rules of holy war became the enemy and should be punished with death. 11, there were exceptions made and there were mutations allowed, especially in the case of combat with those who were not original inhabitants of the Holy Land. You see this in verse 10 to 15 in Deuteronomy 20. And finally, 12, decisive, rapid victory followed faithful holy war. God was the only God who could win a war in a day. Typically, that's how the war was concluded. Battles and wars were not always distinguished, but God was, in that he could win a decisive victory in just one day with amateurs. Excuse me. It's my contention that the holy wars that are mentioned, or the rules for going to war under God's command in Deuteronomy, especially in chapter 20, were meant for one time, for one people, for one circumstance. They're to understand God's patience, God's love, God's desire to protect the Israelite people as they went into Canaan, the land of Canaan, the promised land. They are not things that we should be doing today because we are not under God's command to wage war. I hope this clears things up a little bit for you. And even if I lost the bet, I've enjoyed teaching, I've enjoyed being with you. God bless you and bless your discussion with your small groups today. Goodbye.